Hello, class, and welcome to the second of the week's lectures on sexuality in 18th century Europe. This week, we've been exploring the idea that sex is a social construct. We've looked at a variety of different forms of evidence, both contemporary and historical, that have been used to support this argument. With regard to historical evidence, one of the things that we've learned is that up until quite recently, Western cultures believed that male and female bodies were anatomically and physiologically quite similar, and that the differences between them were of degree, not kind. Ancient medical authorities like Hippocrates and Galen taught that when it came to genitalia, the only difference between males and females was the location of their reproductive organs. Because women were colder, theirs existed inside the body. Being warmer, men's were on the outside. Both male and female bodies were believed to produce seed, and in order for biological reproduction to happen, generative material from both parties was required. This one-sex model remained intact within Western civilization through the medieval period, through the Renaissance, and well into the early modern period. As evidence of this, consider the words of the 16th century anatomist Reinaldus Columbus, who, after performing extensive dissections of male and female cadavers, concluded that women possessed testicles and produced semen, just like men. Over the course of the 18th century, the one-sex model gradually fell out of favor. It was overthrown by the two-sex model, which held that male and female bodies were fundamentally different. In the two-sex model, women no longer possessed testicles or produced semen. Instead, they now had vaginas, ovaries, and uteruses, and produced eggs. This new contrast between male and female bodies spread to non-reproductive anatomy as well, as everywhere they looked, doctors and medical scientists saw divergence and opposition in skeletal structure, in the skin, and even down to the level of tissues. The two-sex model held that males and females possessed fundamentally different kinds of bodies that were not only anatomically distinct from each other, but also had different physiological functions. Most notably, whereas female orgasm was previously thought essential to conception, under the two-sex model, it was regarded as unimportant. Women's sexual organs were now a mere receptacle for sperm, which elevated males to a new level of importance in theories of human reproduction. Thus, the two-sex model demoted women's sexual desire. As the historian Tim Hitchcock has put it, you can see here from his quote on the screen, we're going to take a look at Hitchcock's research more generally as we move forward. One of the things that you may be wondering here is what exactly caused the shift from the one-sex body to the two-sex body. This is not entirely clear. It does not appear that advances in scientific knowledge played much of a role. For example, while scientists today know that women do not need to experience orgasm in order to become pregnant, doctors of the 18th and 19th centuries had no knowledge of this. Indeed, our modern understanding of things like ovulation dates back only as far as the 1930s. So, if not a product of scientific developments, what else might have occasioned this shift from one sex to two? This is a great question, but it's also a whole big thing that I don't have time to deal with here. The short answer is that it has to do with Enlightenment political theories and the doctrine of natural law, which were used to undermine the idea that women should enjoy the same rights as citizens that men did. If you want to know more about this, please do ask about it in our discussions. For now, suffice it to say that the rising popularity of the two-sex model was an example of medicine and science propping up patriarchy and being used to support sexism. The redefinition of anatomical sex, then, did not happen in a vacuum. Neither was it a singular phenomenon. Because of their close historical relationship, typically changes in the way we think about sex bring about changes in the way we think about gender and sexuality, too. This was certainly the case in the 18th century, which gave rise to new forms of sexuality. This is our key question for today. How did the emergence of the two-sex body impact sexuality, either in terms of desires and feelings or in terms of behaviors and acts? How did the 18th century's new doctrine of sexual difference influence the way Europeans understood and experienced themselves sexually? What kinds of new sexual passions might the two-sex model have inspired? And was this accompanied by the delegitimizing of other forms of physical intimacy? In particular, we might wonder here if women's diminished status in the new theories of biological reproduction circulating across the continent in the 18th century resulted in a similar diminishing of their sexualities. Might Enlightenment discourses have elevated men's sexual wants and interests above those of women? And if so, how exactly might we see evidence of this? In answering this question, I want to draw attention to one of the 18th century's most notable sexual fascinations: masturbation. Prior to the Enlightenment, interestingly, it does not appear that anyone cared very much at all about masturbation. Before the 1700s, neither the state, nor the church, nor doctors, nor even moralists wrote very much at all about masturbation. And on the few occasions in which they did, masturbation was not really seen as a dangerous thing. All of this began to change, however, with the Enlightenment. While there is no evidence to suggest that the actual practice of masturbation increased, and really, how could we even know that? Suddenly, for the very first time, in the 1700s, there appeared a vast literature dedicated to explaining the moral, psychological, and physical harms of masturbation, which was now referred to as Onanism. This is in reference to Onan, a minor figure from the Bible whom God kills after he spills his semen on the ground, instead of emptying it into the body of a woman that he had been having sex with. Interestingly, before the 18th century, the quote-unquote sin of Onan was generally associated with coitus interruptus. Now it referred to masturbation, which was transformed into a serious medical concern. The 18th century's masturbation scare began in 1704 when the English preacher Josiah Woodward published a pamphlet called Rebuke of the Sin of Uncleanness. Much more widely read was an anti-masturbatory tract that came out 4 years later in 1708 and was called Onania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution and all its frightful consequences in both sexes considered. This was an anonymous text. Onania went through 19 editions, and it sold almost 40,000 copies in England. It started out as a 60-page pamphlet. Eventually, it grew into a 194-page treatise with a 142-page supplement that consisted of first-hand accounts of the masturbatory habits of various men and women. Onania warned that masturbation led to a loss of vigor for both men and women. Male masturbators, it argued, would suffer from stunted growth, gonorrhea, and other diseases, and frequent fainting as well. Female masturbators, by contrast, might expect hysteria, imbecility, and infertility. Another popular anti-masturbatory tract was the 1758 book Onanism, or a treatise upon the disorders produced by masturbation. Its author was a Swiss doctor named Samuel Tissot, and this volume remained in print until 1905. More than any other writer before him, Tissot theorized the harmful effects of masturbation, placing this within a medical framework that emphasized the importance of retaining sperm. As Tissot had it, sperm was essential to the maintenance of human health. For Tissot, and for a generation of writers who followed him, the loss of sperm was only justifiable in the context of heterosexual relations between husbands and wives. Every other kind of sexual activity, including masturbation, led to disease, and even death. Indeed, by the 19th century, hospital deaths were regularly being attributed to excessive masturbation. The masturbation literature is interesting for a number of reasons. Among other things, books like Tissot's were full of lessons about the importance of procreative sex, which, according to the author, was the only kind of sex that was healthy. In attacking masturbation, Tissot and his colleagues demonstrated their opposition to non-penetrative forms of sexual behavior. For Tissot, penile vaginal intercourse was the only kind of sex that could be countenanced. What we are seeing here is a new form of sexual culture emerging, one that was phallocentric and that made the putting of penises into vaginas the dominant hegemonic form of sexual activity. This was one consequence of the emergence of the two-sex model, which was centered on the idea of female sexual passivity and presented women's reproductive organs as nothing more than a mere receptacle for active male sperm. This was a very different kind of sexual activity than seen before. As evidence of this, consider a memoir published in the mid-18th century by John Cannon, an English farmer. In this memoir, Cannon recounts how in 1705, at the age of 21, he began a love intrigue with his uncle's servant, a woman named Mary Rose. I'm going to let you read the excerpt from his memoir on the screen here to yourself. Just note that in this description, John and Mary talk about the relationship, which went on for 12 years. In it, they never had penetrative sex, although they pursued an active sex life, one that was filled with mutual masturbation, long, drawn-out kissing sessions, fondling, and promises of future marriage. Cannon's memoir is in many ways representative of the kinds of sexual behaviors that were popular and widely practiced before the Enlightenment, that is, before the emergence of a new sexual culture that emphasized penile vaginal intercourse. Over the course of the 18th century, the kinds of activities that Cannon is describing became less and less common. Increasingly, sexual activity meant penile vaginal intercourse. This was a reflection of the growth of a new form of masculinity that was increasingly associated with penetrative heterosexual sex. Increasingly, men felt the need to engage in this kind of sex to demonstrate their normality. As the English historian Tim Hitchcock puts it, simply to fondle and masturbate, even in a heterosexual context, could increasingly cast doubt on the heterosexual identity of courting men. Increasingly, the consensus view was that real men crush pussy. In many ways, then, the rise of the two-sex model paralleled the rise of heterosexuality and the rise of heteronormativity. Moving forward, we might ask how this new phallocentric culture impacted those with same-sex sexual desire. If procreative penile vaginal sex was increasingly the thing one did to prove one's manliness, what did this mean for those men who had no particular interest in this kind of behavior? For more on that, we're going to take a look at a great article by Randolph Trumbach, which is called The Transformation of Sodomy. But for now, let's attend to the questions I posted earlier in the lecture. See you all later. Bye-bye.